Welcome to today's session where we're going to be talking all about responding to climate change as a gardener and a community leader. My name is naturalist David Mizejewski, and I am going to be walking us through this. I'm going to sort of host us today, and I'm actually going to be our main speaker as well. I've been with the Federation for a little over 24 years, and I have been heavily involved in our work in our what we call our Garden for Wildlife space, our work where we encourage folks to restore a little bit of nature by planting native plants and practicing sustainable gardening right where they live in their own yards and communities. And so many of you here today are probably very familiar with all of those programs and work, and are involved in our certified community wildlife habitat level of that work as well. And so I'm really excited because in the last few years, we've been working to develop this talk that looks at how we, again, quote unquote, garden for wildlife through the lens of climate change, which is obviously a huge challenge that we're facing as a planet. And it's obviously a huge priority for the National Wildlife Federation. And so this talk is really going to kind of bring those two pieces of our work, our addressing climate change and the fallout of it, and then also how we can make a difference by looking at our own space, our own yards, gardens, and communities, and how what we plant and how we manage them are going to help address that system or that problem. So before we dive in, just a couple of reminders. We will be taking some questions at the end. And if you do have a question that you want to ask, please use the Q&A button. If you look down on your toolbar, your Zoom toolbar, you'll see that Q&A button. And you could submit your questions there. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. I might actually answer it during the course of the talk. But go ahead and do that as you have questions. Just click on that and you could submit them. The next slide, you might want to grab a pen or maybe just do a screenshot. This is just in case you drop out of this Zoom for whatever reason. We all have tech issues. I literally was just having some 30 seconds before we went live. So if you do, get bumped off, you can always use the link that you were provided to just join again. That's the most simple thing. But you can also call in. There's a number on the screen here, and you can listen that way. So I'll leave this up for just another second or two, so you can jot down this info. Worst case scenario too, you can always put something in the Q&A, and one of my colleagues who are working diligently behind the scenes will help you out. So as I've mentioned, this is sort of what we're going to talk about today, where I'm just wrapping up the overview and intros. I'm going to be doing my talk, Climate Change Through the Lens of Gardening, or Climate Smart Gardening. My colleague, Patrick Fitzgerald, is going to speak after me to go over some action opportunities for community leaders when it comes to addressing climate change through this local scale action. And then we'll do the Q&A. And in between, we've got some fun sort of polls that we're going to be sharing. And no one's going to score you on this. We're just looking to get a little bit of engagement from you, and see what kinds of responses you will all have to some of these fun questions, or interesting questions. Maybe they're not fun. And so, without further ado, this is our first poll question. So you'll see it on your screen here. How concerned are you about climate change? I'm going to leave this up for 30 seconds or so. Just feel free to respond. It's really great for us at the National Wildlife Federation to kind of gauge where folks are with some of these issues and some of this information that we're talking about. It helps us be better at communicating about it, at teaching people about it, and providing opportunities for action. So, all right, looks like most people have responded. So we'll let it go for another few seconds here. Not surprisingly, most of you are very concerned, and there's a few of you who are a little concerned but still hopeful. I think hope is good, and I will say I am going to share some information today about the state of things that isn't really great news, and some numbers that might be scary. But I want you all to kind of come on this journey with me from a place of hope, because if we're going to solve these problems, and we can, we're going to need to preserve that hope, because there is hope as long as we keep doing the work and stay engaged. And so As I go through this talk, again, you're going to hear some scary stats and bad news, but I'm going to end on a high note. So I just wanted to promise that. All right. So I'm not sure if I'm supposed to click share results, but I'm gonna. I think you guys can see now the results. So I was just mentioning, most of you are very concerned. Some of you are a little concerned. Some of you aren't, or no one is not concerned. I think that's probably a good place to be. Okay. So I am now going to get into my talk. So again, this is a talk that looks at the impact of climate change on us as gardeners and stewards of the land at the local level, our own piece of the earth, our own yards, our own gardens, our own community green spaces, right? This is how we first, our most regular interaction with nature. So we're looking at how climate change is not only affecting how we engage with that local land around us, how, what we plant will survive or not, et cetera, but also how we as gardeners and people who are engaged in planting things and nurturing things in our garden spaces, plants can make choices that help actually address climate change. And so I'm going to start first by just a very quick overview of the science of climate change. We've got a fun little animation here. And so what is climate change? So climate change is really all about what's happening on our planet in terms of heat retention. And so the sun produces energy in the form of light and heat that comes to our planet. It hits our planet, it bounces off, and a lot of the light escapes through our atmosphere, and a lot of the heat does too. But some of the heat is sort of trapped by our atmosphere, and that is normal. That's a good thing. Because of that atmosphere trapping heat, that has actually allowed the conditions to develop that resulted in life on this planet. So we need that. The atmosphere and that heat trapping is important. So how the atmosphere does that is that there are certain gases that, again, just sort of trap heat. And I won't get into the gory details of the science there. And carbon dioxide is one of them. And so again, it's normal for carbon dioxide to exist in our atmosphere. It's what we and other living things that breathe exhale. And so, it's normal. And for millennia, for the history of life on this earth, there's this natural carbon cycle where that excess carbon is sort of reused or stored in our ecosystem. Plants absorb it, and then they store it in their bodies. The ocean stores it, and the soil store it, and so on and so forth. So there's sort of like a balance, right? That essentially has remained stable for most of our planet's history. There have been incidences in the past where it spiked, and there has been natural climate change. But what's happening now is that just in the last few hundred years, since the Industrial Revolution, we humans, because of the burning primarily of fossil fuels, but also how we've altered the land, deforestation, and also industrial agriculture, we have massively, massively increased the amount of carbon dioxide that is going into the atmosphere. And as a result, as you would expect, I mean, it's not a surprise that when you put massive amounts of extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that the atmosphere is going to trap more heat. It's just, it makes total sense. And we have exponentially increased the amount of carbon dioxide and other what we call greenhouse gases. These are the gases that trap the heat in our planet. And so that's what's happening. It's well documented. There's scientific consensus that this is happening, and it's being caused by human activity, primarily through the burning of fossil fuels. So what are some of the results of that? And this is, I'm still talking at the global scale, right? So when the climate heats up, and we're talking just a few degrees at the planetary level, right? And what that does is that can have significant impact on the results of climate. So things like weather. So what we are seeing already are things like more frequent and severe extreme weather events. And that includes floods and droughts and heat waves. We're seeing earlier spring snowmelt and lower average snowpack in mountains as a result of the climate change that's already happening. We're seeing the lengthening of frost-free seasons and earlier dates of like the last freeze of the spring. And so, again, we're going to talk more about this in detail. With gardening, these are hugely important things. We're also seeing higher risk of wildfire. So these are all results of climate change. And note, we used to use the term global warming. And we've kind of shifted away from that to climate change because global warming is something that happens, right? When the heat gets trapped and the average temperatures go up by a few degrees. But it's a bigger picture than that because that increase in temperature essentially destabilizes our climate and results in all the things that you're seeing. So some places might actually get cooler. Some places might get drier. Some places might get wetter. It's not just very, a simple one-to-one that it's going to, the planet temperatures go up by a couple of degrees, therefore it's warmer everywhere. This is a fairly recent map that was put out looking at where in the country are going to feel which of some of the main impacts of climate change. So you can just take a glance at that. This doesn't mean that, for example, where I am in New Jersey, we're only going to experience water stress. It just means that is one of the things that's expected to be, and indeed already is, one of the bigger impacts. So this is kind of what we have in store for us happening today, but also into the future if we don't address climate change. All right, so that's just a little bit of an overview on climate change. Let's get into the specific impacts that we're seeing as gardeners. And I'll start by just saying that, gardeners and people who like to plant stuff and nurture the landscape around them, whether it's, in your suburban backyard or whether it's in a rooftop garden in an urban area, whether it's out in the country and you have a big field, anywhere that you can plant stuff, whether or not you identify as a gardener, gardening is the act of planting something for a purpose. So, that's what we think of at National Wildlife Federation as gardeners. And, gardeners have this unique connection to the land that people who don't like to plant stuff probably don't have. We pay attention to the weather and to the temperature cycles and those kinds of things because we need to in order to, kind of successfully grow the stuff we're trying to grow, whether it's for vegetables, for us to eat, whether it's plants that we want, that we're planting to support pollinators and songbirds and other wildlife. We as gardeners, and I count myself amongst this group, we have a special connection. And part of why we are talking about this at the National Wildlife Federation is that we feel that gardeners are really poised to make a difference, to start making some changes and be community voices to start addressing some of these climate change impacts that we as gardeners are actually perpetuating. So we'll talk more about that. So just some examples of how we as gardeners are already feeling the impact of climate change. So you can see from this map here, the darker green is an indicator of the change in the length of the growing days, the seasons. And there's been some significant changes, particularly in the West. And, yes, as a gardener, you think, oh, I had more of a growing season to grow things, but there's some, sort of secondary ramifications of that that are not so good. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So for example, in many places, plants are leafing out and blooming earlier. Again, if, you might think that's a great thing because you like to see pretty flowers, but if you're a pollinator that depends on that plant leafing out or blooming at a certain time period and it's happening earlier, you're at risk of losing an important piece of habitat because you're now out of sync with the plant that you need. And so, for example, these are just some that have been studied. Chinese lilacs, a common ornamental, they're blooming 6 days earlier. Our native butterfly weed, which is one of our milkweeds, they're blooming more than 2 weeks earlier than they used to a few decades ago. Even, if you're from Washington, D.C., the famous cherry blossoms, they're blooming a full week earlier than they used to. And if you've ever scheduled your trip to DC to see the cherry blossoms and they bloomed a week earlier when it's still sort of unstable late winter weather and we get a cold snap and all the blossoms fall off and you just spent your vacation money to come see them and now they're not there, the disappointment. So these are just some examples. We're also seeing changes in migration and breeding patterns of some of our wildlife, including the robin. Robins are resident for the winter in some places, but at the northern part of the range, they do migrate. In Wisconsin, we're seeing the robins are arriving 10 days earlier than they used to. We're even seeing it in the monarch butterflies, which are, as you probably know, are in real trouble. Their populations are really, really plummeted. And there's research that shows that the eastern monarch butterfly are advancing their first flight day by a full 24 days. It's almost a month earlier. And again, that's in the late winter, early spring. So If they're leaving earlier, they're putting themselves at increased risk for, sort of late winter weather, which can still happen. We're seeing the tree swallows. They're actually laying their eggs 9 days earlier on average than they used to. And again, this is happening in very early spring when there's more likely a higher chance of sort of a late winter weather snap that could actually, negatively impact the success of these eggs. So those are just some examples that have been documented. Another way that we as gardeners are probably feeling the heat, no pun intended, is the changes to the USDA hardiness zone maps. Now, if you're already a gardener, you kind of know what these are. This basically measures the temperature range at the cold end that a plant can survive in. And so basically, it's if you're the hardiness zone you want to look at, and if your winters get too hotter or not as cold as what it says on the label, that plant is not going to thrive where you want to plant it. So just in the last 30 years or so, there have been 2 significant updates to this based on climate change. So this was what the map looked like in 1990, and the darker and the bluer colors are the lower hardiness zones, which means that plants can survive a colder winter. In 2006, it changed, and you could see again sort of the cold zones getting smaller and moving a little bit north. Last year, 2 years ago, there was yet another change. Now, these colors are a little bit different, but again, you can see that coldest range has moved all the way out of the US. And in many places, the hardiness zone shifted by up to half a zone. And so, this is happening, and it's not happening over the scale of millennia, which would be sort of the normal natural background climate change. It's happening in the space of just a few decades as a result of human action. Some other examples that we're seeing on animals that might inhabit our gardens. So some species, they're beginning to shift their range. And I'm going to flip to my notes here because I want to make sure I get some of these numbers right. So this is a butterfly, the Sachem skipper, and it's actually expanded its range by up to 420 miles from California to Washington State in 35 years. So, again, maybe that's great for that particular species. It's opening up new habitat. But that's not the case for all species. And in fact, there are some species that are having the opposite problem. And so there have been some studies looking at bumblebee species, both in North America and in Europe, that have shown some pretty disturbing results. And that is, well, here, let me just show you the map here. So this particular study looked at bumblebee species in the sort of the southwestern area of North America, Mexico and the US. And this, what you're seeing on the screen, is the thermally tolerable habitat for these bumblebee species currently. Now, what we're seeing, and there's the species range, you see it overlaps, almost 1-to-1 with that temperature range that these insects need. What we're seeing with climate change is that this thermally tolerable range is moving northward. But for unknown reasons, scientists are still studying this, the bumblebees have not migrated in their range for whatever reason. And so what the end result is that the available habitat for these bumblebees is shrinking because of climate change. And that's a big problem. Bumblebees are really important in the ecosystem, just like all bee species, as pollinators, as food for other wildlife, and so on and so forth. So again, the main message here is that climate change is destabilizing our climate, and it's having all of these results that are rapidly changing things, and some species are just not going to be able to adapt. This is another example of an impact on a butterfly species. And again, this is the Edith checker spot, and it's already, what's happening here is that there's a mismatch between when its host plant, its caterpillar host plant, is available because of the climate change impact on weather, and when the butterfly is actually active. So if the butterflies are active looking for the host plant to lay their eggs, and the host plant is not sprouted, or then that mismatch is going to cause a significant impact on that butterfly's habitat. I'm going to move us along here because I got a lot more to get through. There's also threats to some of our iconic native species. So this is a flowering dogwood, which is the state flower and tree, I believe, of the state of Virginia, and it's predicted to actually move completely out of Virginia as far as its natural habitat goes. So, there's some sort of cultural impacts that are going to be happening as well. So there's threats to agriculture. Many of our crops require colder temperature winters in order to, sort of thrive and successfully bloom and bear, fruit or nuts and things like that, cherries, almonds, apples. So, that is important for commercial agriculture. But if you like to grow these things, that could be a problem as well. If you are a wine lover, our wine grapes are also seeing a real shift in sort of the availability of good habitat under climate change. I'm going to, again, move pretty quickly, but a lot of this stuff is covered in a more detailed report that you can find on our website that we'll share if you want to read a little bit more about it. There's even more challenges from climate change that we as gardeners are facing. How many of you have faced water restrictions where you live in recent years, like the last decade? In many places, we're seeing hotter, drier weather and less rainfall, and that is resulting in water shortages that are causing, municipal level, water restrictions that then impact what plants are going to survive in our yards. Pests. Let's talk about pests. So these are aphids. Again, if you are any kind of gardener, you know that aphids can be a real problem. And so, whoops, I'm skipping ahead here. Let me find my place here, because I have a pretty crazy stat here about aphids. So we're seeing aphids actually reproducing more rapidly and more prolifically under current climate change conditions. And so I'm going to just read this from my notes, which come from the report that I mentioned. In terms of garden pests, some of them do, quote unquote, like it hot. One study found that a 5.5 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature could mean the difference between aphids that produce 30,000 offspring versus those that produce over 1 million offspring over a 2-month period. I don't know about you, but I've got aphids all over my milkweed right now, and I don't want more. So, it can cause everything, powdery mildew as well. So it's not just animal diseases, it's other issues like that. And so, this is happening now, and it's predicted to get a lot worse. English ivy, lots of invasive non-native plant species are growing more robustly as a result of climate change because there's more carbon and plants need the carbon. And so they're growing more and becoming more of a challenge to keep under control. Purple loosestrife is another. Whoops. Kudzu, if you're from anywhere in the Southeast, you know kudzu well. This stuff is marching north because of the milder winters. It can survive further north. So just some examples of plant non-native invasive species that are becoming even more problematic than they already were. This is the spongy moth. This is a huge non-native forest pest. And so this is another species that is becoming more of a problem under the changes in climate that we're currently seeing and predicted to get even worse. And it's not just non-native invasive species, even our native species that can be pests sometimes, we're seeing worse impacts. So these are pine beetles, which are native, but because of the climate conditions, they're actually having much more of an impact on our western forests, which is a double whammy, because when these trees are killed by the pine beetles, then they become even more of a risk for wildfires, which are more likely to happen under the current and future conditions under climate change. So, like I said, it's a lot, I know, and a lot of it is bad news. I mean, ultimately, what this boils down to is a disaster and a catastrophe for wildlife. And I know this is disturbing to look at, but I do think it's really important to know and see what the consequences of our actions are on our planet, on our fellow species, and notably our own species, our neighbors, our fellow species, our fellow human beings. I mean, there are communities all around the world who are being impacted disproportionately by these changes as well. It's not just the wildlife, and I know these are not North American animals, these are giraffes, but this is happening here. So I mentioned the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly, both the eastern and the western population are in real trouble, and climate change is impacting it. The eastern monarch population numbers that came out this spring, we track their population every year, were really low. They plummeted, I think, almost by 60% over last year. And a big part of the reason was extreme weather caused by climate change. Storms while they were migrating, extreme freak cold events down in Mexico where they overwinter. So it's having an impact, and we're seeing it real time in some of these species that we call, backyard wildlife. We call them our neighbors. It's not just impacting polar bears in the Arctic. It's impacting wildlife that we see and know and love, and we're trying to help out by what we plant in our yards. So climate change is a big factor here. All right, there's the gloom and doom. Everybody take a deep breath. Now we're going to talk about what you all can do as gardeners, as local stewards of the land that can make a difference. And I'll say this, none of these solutions are going to solve the problem of climate change. These are local level personal actions. And, you are not responsible on the individual level for changing this, right? We have to take collective action, big picture action, etc. But I want to share these with you because little changes do add up. And if I do them and you do them and your neighbor does them, there really could be significant change. And it's really important because I think it also helps us keep hope, right? If we have something tangible that we can do, it keeps us engaged. So in that spirit, well, this is everything I was just saying a second ago. You can make difference. You can take action. And that's what, again, really all of the National Wildlife Federation's work in the Garden for Wildlife and Certified Wildlife Habitat and Community Wildlife Habitat space and all of our related programs, our Mayor's Monarch Pledge program and our Sacred Grounds program that encourages the planting of native plants and these wildlife habitat gardens are places of worship. There's so many different ways that we can do this and hopefully adopt some of these climate smart gardening tips that I'm going to give you to make as much of a difference as possible. So first and foremost, plant native plants. This is the core message of all of our Garden for Wildlife work, because we know that native plants, they are the plants that wildlife co-evolved with, and our wildlife species are going to be under, and they already are, stress and pressure from climate change. So if all you have are lawns and non-native plants that don't support anything, your community is going to be less resilient to these impacts of climate change, and the wildlife will have just that much more of a difficult time surviving. So plant as many natives as you can, and that's going to really sort of bolster the landscape where you live and make it, again, more resilient to survive these impacts of climate change that we've been talking about. And, this is something a little bit new and different to think about. We talk about planting native species, and most of you, again, on this call are probably very familiar with what that means. The indigenous plants of your region that evolved over millennia. But something you might want to think about is, think less about that hardiness zone map that just, categorizes plants by one criterion, which is that sort of winter temperature. And, you might want to look at your ecoregion. There are all of these different ecoregions in North America. And one of the things that's getting a lot of conversation right now in climate adaptation circles in the world of conservation is, perhaps we should be thinking a little bit more broadly about what's native. So if you have to plant a long-lived plant like a tree in your yard or in your community somewhere, maybe you don't want to plant something that's sort of, where you are is the southernmost part of its range, because it's likely to get warmer where you are. So maybe you want to think about planting things that, are found a little bit further south in your ecoregion, preparing for the future, because that plant's hopefully going to be there for decades and maybe even centuries. And if you plant something that in 10 years is going to be not matched with the climate because its range has migrated north or it's totally disappeared from where you are, maybe that's missing an opportunity to plant sustainably. So just something to think about that adds a little bit more nuance to the whole idea of planting native plants. Some other things you can do, and these are all very simple. Plant trees. Trees provide shade, and shade helps with retaining soil moisture in the garden. It provides, coolness for us, for humans, and for wildlife. So wherever you are, even in places that aren't naturally forested, there are, bigger plants that you can include, whether they are technically trees or not, that can provide shade. They also shade our houses, by the way, and help minimize energy costs. Another thing you can do is grow your own food. You're not going to be able to grow everything you eat, most likely, but there is a climate impact, climate pollution impact from transporting food around the globe. So I live in New Jersey. If I'm eating a tomato that got here from California or Mexico, there's a carbon footprint to that compared to me growing it in my own yard. So this is just a simple thing that you can do that can potentially have a little bit of an impact. And also, we all know that homegrown tomatoes are way better than the mass manufactured one. So there's that little side benefit as well. Think about energy efficiency in your landscape. So think about the kind of lights you're using. Old school incandescent light bulbs not only use way more electricity than modern LED lights, but they can also actually be a sink for wildlife. All those insects that fly around your lights at night. The incandescent bulbs, the bright white light ones, actually are very attractive. But if you use amber colored LED lights, not only will you be using less fossil fuels to light your landscape, but you'll also be killing less insects because there's less insects that are drawn to them. So, just a kind of an interesting way that you might minimize your own carbon footprint in your landscape. And side note on that outdoor lighting, try to turn it off at night, after you go to bed, after you're not out there, because light pollution is a real huge problem for migratory birds, for sea turtles in coastal areas and other wildlife. So, you want to make sure you're thinking about that as well. This is a big one. Think about the tools you're using to maintain your yard or your garden. A traditional gasoline-powered lawnmower, for example, a 2- and 4-stroke engine model, burns as much fossil fuel, or I'm sorry, produces as much pollution as driving a mid-range vehicle, something that gets an average of like 25 miles per gallon, about 650 miles. So again, think about driving your mid-sized sedan for 650 miles and all of the carbon pollution that gets emitted. 1 hour of running a lawnmower produces the same amount. So really do your best to shift to electric if you can. That is still fossil fuel based, but it uses exponentially less of that fossil fuels and produces much less emissions. It also produces a lot less noise. And if you're like me and you live in suburbia and you get driven nuts by all the leaf blowers and weed trimmers and lawnmowers that are droning all day, the electric models are much better. But you know what? What's even better than that? A good old-fashioned push mower. Good exercise, get your cardio, mow your lawn, and of course, probably the best thing you could do is minimize or get rid of that lawn altogether in favor of plantings of native beds. Then it's not an issue. So that's a significant one that, again, if we all did that, if we all shifted from gasoline to electric, it would really add up. Another thing you can do is leave your leaves in the yard. We're coming up on fall season in many places. People are going to be out there raking up all the leaves and throwing them out. When you do that, it's the worst possible thing. They get sent to the landfill where they break down in anaerobic conditions and produce methane, which is even more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And it's significant. There's something like more than 30 million tons of organic matter, much of which is yard waste that gets sent to the landfill. It's something like 13% of the contents of landfills. And landfills are the third sort of biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions after burning of fossil fuels and the deforestation and agriculture. So this is significant. Instead, use the leaves as Mother Nature made them to be, as a natural mulch and fertilizer in your garden beds. And the side benefit is that leaf layer is incredible habitat for all sorts of cool wildlife, like salamanders, like many of our native moths, which are important pollinators, like many birds which forage in that leaf layer, like all sorts of microorganisms and invertebrates. There's even a bat, the eastern red bat, that hibernates under the leaf layer. So keep those leaves on your property as much as you can. It'll help with climate change and it'll help with wildlife habitat. You can compost at home, compost the food waste, keep that out of the landfill too. And you can also compost your excess leaves if you have too many of them to put in your garden beds. And the difference here than going to the landfill is that oxygen is present here. And this is not producing the methane when you do a home composting. And then you get compost, which is great fertilizer for your plants. Practice organic gardening, rely on tried and true organic gardening techniques. Don't spray pesticides, many of which are manufactured with fossil fuels. Handpick, rely on natural predators of pests like ladybugs, etc. Save water. Reduce by planting natives and approaching your landscape from a xeriscaping point of view, like what can I plant that will require the minimal amount of watering? You can brace your garden space for the impacts of climate change. You can save rainwater if it's legal where you are in a rain barrel, and that actually reduces your sort of water footprint, if you will. You can use that rainwater to water your plants, even your house plants. I have tons of house plants, including carnivorous plants and things that can't take the chlorine and stuff and the minerals in my tap water, I use the rainwater for that. And I should say too, that in some places, like the majority of the potable water, over 50% in some places, are being used to water lawns. That's insanity. Please stop doing that. Reduce the lawn, replace the lawn, plant things that are native, that are drought tolerant, and then we can actually save that water for people to drink and for more important uses like agriculture. You can use mulch, which minimizes evaporation. Just make sure you use sort of what we call the right kind. You want to avoid things like cypress mulch, which is not sustainably harvested, and peat moss, which is also not sustainably harvested. And peat actually is a big storer of carbon. So the more we dig it up, the more carbon we release into the environment. Go for shredded hardwood or pine bark chips or things like that. The best mulch is green mulch, where you plant your beds so densely that the plants themselves kind of cover the ground and suppress weeds and retain soil moisture. Plant a rain garden. These are specifically sort of constructed gardens meant to hold rainwater. And under climate change, we're seeing more severe weather events, more heavy rains, which cause all sorts of bad downstream effects, erosion in our streams, pollution that runs off our roads. A rain garden is meant to sort of act as a sponge and absorb a lot of that water that otherwise would go shooting down the curb and down the storm drain into the local stream. So this is something, a little bit of a bigger project that you can create in your own landscape. And I'm wrapping up here, but I just want to say you can do all this in your own garden, your own backyard, your own landscape, whatever you have. But it's also important to get beyond your backyard and do it in your community. All of these things can be done at the community level, in your local park, your local garden club. Again, even if you're in a densely urban area, you don't have your own space. Every city has a community garden network. And so join that and start doing some of these things on that community level. It makes a huge difference. One other idea that you can do is become involved in community science. There's a great project. This is not a National Wildlife Federation program, but it's called Project Budburst, where you can record observations of things like when you saw the first butterfly, or when you saw the first bird nest, or when the first dogwood blooms happen. And the data that you submit actually is used to study phenology, which is sort of the study of like seasonal change and the sequencing of things. So sequencing of that. So that's something you can do. And lastly, like I said at the beginning, all this personal action is really, really important, and we all should be doing it, but it's not a substitution for big picture level solutions. The only way we're really going to solve climate change is at that macro level, and passing policy and regulation to get us away from fossil fuels and incentivize our whole planet really to move towards clean energy, so that we can stop climate change from getting worse and maybe even reverse some of the worst effects. So make sure you think about that at that bigger picture community level, that policy level, and operate at both levels, the local level, the personal action, and this bigger picture level, because this is the real message. Later's too late, folks. This is happening now. So everything that we can do now, starting today, is important. So get out there, adopt some of these practices, and be part of the solution, and feel good about it. It's okay to feel good. In fact, I would say it's a requirement to keep the hope alive and keep the good work happening. And all of you out there are community leaders. Spread the word and inspire other people to get involved as well. I went a little bit long, so I'm going to quickly move to our next poll question. There you go. So on a scale of 1 to 3, have you noticed the effects of climate change in your area? Any of the things that I talked about: more extreme weather events, more drought, more cold weather, more wet weather, more erosion, animals that used to be present but that you're not seeing them, or you're seeing them earlier or later. Any of those things. The numbers are coming in. I'm going to go for a few more seconds here. All right, so the results are in, and again, not surprisingly, most of you are seeing some of these impacts right where you live, and some, maybe less so. But yeah, folks, it's real, it's happening, and it's not shocking. It's a very simple scientific concept that the result that we're seeing is absolutely what you can expect when the actions that we've taken have happened. And so it's really not surprising that we're seeing those. So I'm going to pass the baton over to Patrick now, and Patrick's again going to walk through some actions that community leaders can take. So Patrick, take it away.
I had a mute issue. I'm back.
Thank
you,
okay.
Dave. Really appreciate you joining us today and sharing this. It's really wonderful. So Dave touched on some ways to take action in your community already, but I'm going to share some additional ideas with you in the next couple of slides. The actions will vary for each community and depending on your role. So we know today on this webinar, I see some familiar names. We have local elected officials, municipal staff, leaders at the neighborhood level, and also like representatives from community-based organizations. But I do think that the most important thing we can do after this webinar is take what we learned and apply it out in your community. So next slide, Dave. So in your role as a community leader, whatever your role might be, you have a network that needs to understand how climate change is impacting wildlife and habitat. So you can spread the word and share NWF or other local resources. This can be done through social media, email newsletters, community meetings, educational workshops. In the photo here is the city of Pembroke Pines in Broward County, Florida, that set up a table at a cultural festival. So there's a lot that can be done. And please remember to use multilingual communications to be inclusive and reach all the members of your community. Next slide, Dave.
Sorry about that.
All good. So here's the Broward County Climate Action Plan. So I wanted to lift this up as well. As a local elected official, you can incorporate nature-based solutions to climate change in your city or county climate action plan. This might include green infrastructure projects that incorporate native plants, living shorelines, wetland protections, or just education for residents on how they can support a plan in their own backyard. Every community is different, but the idea is to just get these ideas of biodiversity and nature into municipal planning documents, whether it's a climate action plan, a sustainability plan, or other master planning that's done at the community and municipal level. The next slide, please. And this is pretty simple. Plant meadows instead of turf grass. And of course, I say it's pretty simple, but it actually can be a little complicated to get done in communities. But the more we can get rid of turf grass, plant meadow landscapes, it really helps communities reduce their carbon footprint and create really beautiful habitat for wildlife and people to enjoy. And you can do this along roadsides, along medians, rights of ways. This is along a path in Yellow Springs, Ohio. So there's lots of different opportunities. Municipalities, if you're working for a municipality, you can encourage meadow planting through landscape ordinances for new developments, permitting residential projects, and even you simply integrating some of these plantings into your own municipal landscaping at municipal buildings, parks, and so forth. Let's go on to the next. All right, and Dave kind of touched on this already, so I'm going to go quick on this one. But less gas-powered landscaping equipment, less pollution, less noise pollution. You're saving money often, and so there's many ways to address this issue at the community level. And I actually want to highlight one from where I live. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of DC. The county passed legislation banning the sale of gas-powered leaf blowers, which went into effect July 1st of this year. And so you can't purchase as of July 1st. As of July 1st next year, you're not allowed to use them at all. So there's a $500 fine for using gas powered blowers after that time. So these types of advocacy efforts, or if you have amenable local elected officials, can really, they can happen. And the county is also providing rebates to small businesses to help transition to electric blowers. So it's there are efforts to kind of take care of those small businesses that are in the landscaping industry. Next slide, Dave. So the next few slides are just a few resources to help with your climate smart gardening efforts. So first, we want to make you aware of a special offer from gardenforwildlife.com, where you can get a discount on bulk native plants for your fall plantings. And this is active through August 31st. We have native milkweed species. We have flats of different plants, and you can learn more online. We'll be sure to include a link in the follow-up. Next, Dave. We have a wonderful online nature-based solutions funding database that communities can come to and focuses on federal funding and technical assistance for nature-based solutions. So I encourage you to check out this site as well. Next slide. We have a fantastic blog about hardiness zones and ecoregions. So this is some of the content that Dave covered earlier in his presentation. We'll share the link to this blog after the webinar. Next slide. So here is the Resilient Schools and Communities Program Curriculum, also known as RISC, a project that started in New York and has moved to some other areas. And just for those of you working with schools, this is a really wonderful curriculum that you can access and see different activities and ideas, again, for partnering with schools. Largely focused at middle and high school is this curriculum. Next slide. We have a report on our website also, how natural disasters are intensified by climate change. It's called Unnatural Disasters. Wonderful story map, lots of illustrations. So encourage you to check that out as well. Next slide. And last but not least, Dave should probably talk about this because he authored this along with our former senior scientist, Patty Glick. But we published the garden side.
I didn't
jump in.
It's not me. I can't take credit. Patty Glick is our former climate scientist. She wrote this report back in 2006, I think, before she retired a few years ago. I did work with her to update her slide deck, which what you just saw. And the thing that's important to note is that this is an older report. It's 2007, but most of it is still totally accurate. And in fact, some of the numbers have gone up. So just wanted to give that caveat. So back to you, Patrick.
I'm glad you did that, Dave. Trying to give Dave more credit, I guess. All right, next slide. We're here to our Q&A session. I know we've had a few questions already answered in the QA function, but I'll turn it back over to you, Dave.
Yeah, so thanks, Patrick. I think it's really important, again, to get involved at that community leader level. And I'm, again, just really excited that so many community leaders are here today, and hopefully you'll take advantage of some of those resources. So we've got some questions. Looks like we've got 3. So I'm just gonna, let's see, we've got a few minutes here, so we're going to do our best to answer these. So Barbara Acosta asks, we need sources of potting soil that do not contain peat. Are there any brands that you know of? I don't have an answer for that one. To be honest with you, I would read the ingredients. You could also mix your own potting soil mixes and avoid peat. If you start Googling, there is some good information out there about, sort of soilless mix or peatless mixes and things like that. One thing I can say is use your voice as a consumer, and that's hugely powerful, right? Whether it's going to your local nursery and asking if they treat their plants with neonicotinoid pesticides, or if they're carrying native plants. Same thing here. Ask at your local retailer if they're selling any, potting mixes that do not contain peat moss. Because when they hear from consumers, from their customers, it's quite frankly a lot more impactful than those of us at National Wildlife Federation just telling them that they should do it, right? So that's something I would say. I know for just speaking personally, my local nursery has some great soil amendments and topsoil type things that include mushroom compost, which is sort of a byproduct of the commercial mushroom growing industry. And it has similar properties, I guess. It's got a lot of fiber in there that can help loosen up soils, which is what, one of the things that peat moss does. So hopefully that's helpful. Let's move on to, it looks like Deb Rudnick says, I'm not sure that lawnmower statistic is accurate. Regardless, if you scale up the amount of the lawnmower use in the US, it's extremely significant. Thanks for this. I'm going to take a look at that. We updated the stats in this presentation just a few months ago, and I had our climate team look at it, but we certainly will make sure that that is an accurate number because it is rather shocking, right? Whoops. I don't know if I just, hang on. Can you guys see this that I just clicked on? Anybody want to give me a thumbs up? Are you still seeing my presentation?
We see the Q&A page.
Okay, all right. Because I clicked off the presentation because I clicked on the link that Deb sent. So Deb also asks, there are no native plants available for my state from the NWF plant site. Oh, this is a great question. Any idea when Pacific Northwest might get some availability? We're really struggling with finding local sources for natives. There are a few, but they're expensive and far from us. So what Deb is referring to is gardenforwildlife.com, otherwise known as Garden for Wildlife, Inc. This is the retail native plant program that the National Wildlife Federation helped launch. It is a for-profit entity, so it is a separate organization, obviously connected to the National Wildlife Federation, and we do, we do benefit from the sales and that kind of thing. So the program started maybe 3 years ago, mostly in the East, and each year there have been new states and new growers added. Still not there in the Pacific Northwest, I believe in the desert Southwest and maybe California. I can't answer when they will be available in your regions, but know that those conversations are happening. And I think it's important to answer the reason why. It's because what we're really trying to do is not only sell good native plants that are going to not be treated with pesticides, be the straight species and not cultivars that are very unlike the wild plants and therefore less likely to be beneficial to wildlife. We're trying to really change the horticulture industry with this program. And so by investing as much as we have, both in hours and dollars and talent in this Garden for Wildlife, Inc. Endeavor, the hope is that we're going to provide a system and a structure where the hort industry will be incentivized because they'll know that there's a customer base to grow more native plants and the right kind of native plants, the locally native plants, and to have them available on that local regional level. So that takes time. What I can recommend is that you reach out. Deb, I don't know where in the Pacific Northwest you are, but we do have some really great folks working in Oregon and in the Seattle area that cover sort of that region. And they do have a lot of local knowledge and resources, including native plant knowledge and nurseries. So, maybe you could reach out to whoever your contact is at NWF and see if you can get connected with some of those resources. All right, we are almost out of time. And Barbara Hobens, hi Barbara, asked, how about the impact of battery operated mowers, pruners, and chainsaws? Again, I don't know the exact answer to that. Batteries are a whole other can of worms, that have their own fallout in terms of, recycling or not, and, the chemicals inside of them. But it's actually a good question for us to do a little bit more research on. Again, I think most of those are electric, right? It's like rechargeable batteries, that kind of thing. And that certainly is a better option than gasoline powered. All right, so let's see. I have maybe 2 more minutes. And there's a couple last slides I want to get to. So Let me see. Let me move on to CP says, is it possible to share direct us to municipal development planning examples slash case studies involving planting meadows instead of turf grass? Funny you should ask, because the National Wildlife Federation did develop a resource that is aimed at communities that maybe Patrick or others can share, that gets at that question, CP. So check in with your contacts, and we'll get you what we have. And here's Deb again, who says, thank you, Deb. I'm connected with some more local NWF folks. The problem is relatively rural and far from bigger cities. So that's a real challenge too. It might be an always issue, but what I will say, I do have a couple tips. Grow and propagate native plants at the community level. I don't know if you've already connected with your local native plant society. Many of them have chapters and people, that are doing plant swaps and sharing seeds. Here in my community, I live in New Jersey, I mentioned, in Maplewood. I'm just about 13 miles outside of New York City. As the crow flies, I can be in lower Manhattan in about 13 miles. But one of my neighbors has developed a little seed library specifically for native plants. And I think it was the first one that ever, that she was sort of the first one in the country to do it, or at least talked about it. So that's, tap into your neighbors and your local folks. And if you're into plants and into propagation, it can actually be a really fun grassroots, no pun intended, way to get more native plants out into the landscape where you might not have a native plant nursery. So Kathy Hall says the conservation districts in Pierce and Kitsap counties have large native plant sales every year. Thank you, Kathy. Mary Lou Node, this is the last one I'm going to read because we do have to go. It says, thank you so much. Working Wisconsin, certified wildlife habitat. Thank you. We're almost halfway to 400 points. Woot, keep going. Still many gardens to go, but we're making progress. This is inspiring, and I believe a rain barrel will be my next garden addition. I can't think of a more perfect note to end on. Thank you, everybody, for listening, for watching. I'm going to go back here to I'm going to close the Q&A. Okay, so can everybody see my screen for my last couple slides?
Yes.
Okay. Last poll, on a scale of 1 to 3, how likely are you to employ adaptive strategies, which is everything we just talked about, to address climate change in your community? Anybody who's still on board online here, we'd love your answers. Hopefully you were inspired today and picked up a few tips and tricks that you can, try out. I'm sure many of you are already doing a lot of what we talked about today, but hopefully, there's some new stuff that you can take, or new ways of talking about it that you can pay it forward and share with others. So, all right. So it looks like most of you have responded. We'll give it a couple more seconds here. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and the results are in. Most of you are very likely, and I'll just say thank you for that. And the reason all of us at the National Wildlife Federation do the work that we do and have chosen this for our career is that we're passionate about this and we want to help make a difference. And so it's really, really powerful for us to hear from you that we're sharing good info and that you're going to use it. You just gave, you made my day and my week. So thank you for that. So I will finish up here by just saying thank you. And there's lots of ways to get involved. Some of you are already involved in some of these endeavors, but again, connect with our community wildlife habitat team if you're not, and you have questions, whether it's the Mayor's Monarch Pledge, our community wildlife habitat endeavors, our Garden for Wildlife work. There's lots and lots of ways to get involved at the local level to restore our own little piece of the earth, our own yards, our own gardens, and our own community. Think globally, act locally. It's the old saying. That's what this is all about. So thanks, everybody, and keep up the fantastic work.